Awesome. So, welcome everybody to tonight's session. I'm really excited for the session because we have Davidson who's going to be talking to us about code reviews and guiding us through how we can write proper PRs and going through on the reviewer side how a reviewer can properly assess a PR so that they can both contribute to the PR and get things shipped as fast as possible. So, without further ado, here's Davidson, and I'm going to you can do a little intro and then kick things off.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'll quickly just share my screen. Intros accounted for in the presentation, so wait for that
Fair.
particular slide to come up, but there we go. All right. So like Nelson so graciously introduced, my name is Davidson. And today I'll be talking a lot about code reviews and pull requests, specifically an overview and guideline on code reviewing and writing pull requests. So the docket for today, I'm going to cover 5 different topics at a high level. So the first are a general overview on what code reviews and pull requests are. The second is a sort of look at these processes in practice. The third is going into your role as an author, then your role as a reviewer, and finally, ways on how you can improve in both capacities. So before we get started, here's a slide, a little bit about me. So my name is Davidson Lee. Currently, I'm working as a senior full stack developer at a company called Ada Support. Ada Support is all about chatbots and customer support use cases. Lots of cool stuff with generative AI and messaging. Reach out to me on the side if you're ever interested. But been working there for a couple of years and been working as a full stack developer for around 5 years now. Personally, I come from a self-taught background. Didn't go to school for computer science or attend any boot camps. Completely self-taught, and I transitioned from actually a career in the banking industry. So I'm well aware of some of the struggles that a lot of junior developers and developers in general have in this space, especially coming from a non-traditional background. Again, if you want to chat about tips or thoughts there, then I'd be happy to chat with you. And lastly, I actually live in Dieppe, New Brunswick, which I think for the vast majority, if not all of you, would be the first time you've heard of that place in the world. It's a small little city over on the east coast of Canada, in the province of New Brunswick, pretty close to Moncton, if you've heard of there, which is the largest city in New Brunswick. Beautiful East Coast life. Highly recommend looking into it. I live there with my 2 puppies, as you can see in the photo, Goma and Kino, and they take up 100% of my time outside of work. So that's enough about me. Moving on, just want to chat about what code reviews are and also what pull requests are. So first of all, code reviews. Before actually jumping into the session, I just want to preface that, I understand many of you might have an idea of what code reviews and pull requests are through experience with, software like GitHub or Bitbucket or Git in general. So this might be a review for some of you, but I am going to put a little bit of a twist on some of these takes. So hopefully there's some value in there for you as well. So code reviews, took this definition from GitLab. I thought it was a very, very strong one. It's a methodical assessment of code to identify bugs, increase code quality, and help developers learn the source code. So as a practice, it's considered a quality assurance practice. So it's there in order for us as developers to sort of gatekeep our own code and to maintain a certain level of standards through some kind of intervention before allowing that code to reach the hands of users in a production environment. It's also a tool for learning. So code reviews are typically, an assessment of a particular set of code changes. There's context involved there where those code changes have to be for a specific purpose. So in the process of learning what the code changes are and what purpose it's meant to achieve, there's always opportunities for people to learn, especially if they're not familiar with that part of the code base, the style of code being written, or the business domain for which the problem is solving. And the last point, which I found very interesting and important, is that code reviews are not necessarily performed by a human. So if you look at the definition and sort of the purpose that they serve, While typically, a process performed by humans, it's not necessarily only by humans. So with the advent of like generative AI and sort of GPT-like systems, large language models, all those kind of fun stuff, and even in the past before with automated tooling, there are a lot of tools that can be used, for example, like Sonar Cloud, CodeQL, which can review code for you or for developers and provide, an insight or recommendations or a assessment of the code from those automated perspectives. So yeah, just want to put it out there. It's not just a human practice. It's also, in many ways, an automated and machine-driven practice as well. Any questions on that topic before I proceed on pull requests? No, perfect. All right, so moving on to pull requests, or as they're more sort of regularly known as PRs. Um, These are, and taken from a definition from Atlassian, a user-friendly web interface for discussing proposed changes before integrating them into the official project. So I just want to point out here, a lot of folks get pull requests and code reviews sort of mixed up. And it's very common to see because they are very tightly linked. So you would mostly see code reviews um, uh, be done or people take part in code reviews in a pull request or for a pull request. And typically they're done in that user-friendly web interface that was discussed here. So that's what a pull request is, and what is the purpose of them? So the purpose of pull requests is number one, to notify team members that they have completed a task or a feature. So in a team setting, you can imagine if a lot of people are pushing changes and have a lot of proposed changes for the production code base, it can get pretty crazy keeping track of all of them. If you get to engineers in like the hundreds, thousands of engineer numbers, then it becomes almost impossible to track that without some sort of system managing that for you. And pull requests are a great system for that. Secondly, it's a dedicated forum for discussing the proposed changes. That forum could be where things like a code review would take place or some other informal discussion related to the changes as a whole. Third, just to talk a bit about the jargon on pull request. A pull request is typically to display changes which are in a branch, which branches off a base branch. So changes are pushed to a branch which contain your code changes. That branch is sort of branching off an existing branch, which is called the base branch. And in the production environment, that would typically be a branch called main, or for sort of older code bases, which haven't made the inclusivity changes of name changing, might be called master. Common softwares used for pull requests could be Bitbucket or more commonly GitHub. Yeah, that's about it for pull requests. Any questions on that topic?
Yeah, so I think for pull requests, so there are things that were kind of I'm just trying to understand this, but like they've just been kind of like built up after through like stuff like Bitbucket and GitHub specifically. Like they weren't there in Git originally.
Mhm. That is correct.
And then basically that was just an opportunity to kind of like talk about the code before it was actually merged.
100%. Yep, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I thought it was the other way around, but I suppose not. Interesting.
Got it. Yep. So great point. So Git is sort of like the underlying system which tracks changes in code and allow developers to simultaneously develop their code and manage the or do change management for the code. So things like the branches, merging, rebasing, merge conflicts, all those kind of lingo. Those are all related to the Git system. Whereas a software like GitHub or Bitbucket is taking the changes which are represented in Git and then present them in a user-friendly web interface. So that's where you can create your PRs to show code differences and enable that forum. But it is, yes, a result of the Git system and not the other way around. So that was a great question. Yeah, I can't imagine the dark ages of before things like GitHub were around and how they managed that before my time, and I am scared to find out what that was like. All right, perfect. Any other questions on the topic? No, perfect. All right, moving on. So processes in practice. Sorry, can't talk today. Here, I'm just going to really briefly just show you some screenshots of a PR that I wrote at work to sort of take you through the components, very high level, what a pull request is and sort of what you can expect. So this is a screenshot of my PR description. So this is on GitHub. You can see that our company sort of mandates this format of, a why, what, and how in terms of why the PR was opened, what the changes are, and how can someone test the changes. Not going to go too deep into the subject matter because it is quite domain specific, but long story short, at our company, we use PRs to present what the changes are, both at a conceptual level in the why section and a technical level in the what section, making that differentiation because it does help to understand the conceptual aspect first, or the like in plain English reason why this PR exists versus just looking at the code and inferring it yourself. And then finally, on the how can someone test the changes, that sort of serves the purpose of making it easier for reviewers to prove that the code does work and that it is effective. So that's an example of a PR description that you might see. This is an example of a code difference you might see in a PR. So for this file, platform/live agent/whatever, on the left, you can see the old code, and on the right, you can see the new code. Red denoting the code that was removed or changed as part of this, these code changes, and the green denoting new additions of code. So I can see here on lines 230 onwards, you can see my addition of, this metrics.increment call over here. And also over here, just added a couple of metric calls, and those new additions are in the green. Finally, I sort of omitted the name, but this is a comment written by one of the reviewers of this PR. You can see, changes LGTM or looks good to me. Tested the system and saw that, through these two tests, it is resulting in the behavior that is expected for the code changes, with the note that they were unable to perform a specific action. Again, just an example of a comment you might see in an actual company or as a production level pull request. So that's about it there. So before we get lost in in what all that is, I guess I want to talk first about the two roles that exist within the sort of code review process. And the first role that I want to talk about is your role as an author. So what is an author of a pull request? So the author of a pull request is the writer of a pull request who owns the proposed code changes. So in the example that we saw, that pull request was opened by me, and those code changes were owned and written by me. So I would be the author of that pull request. So as an author of the pull request, your primary goal is to prove to somebody else that your code works. So it is technically ultimately that you want your changes merged in, but more importantly than that, you are proposing a set of code changes to be accepted into the final product or into what is available for the end users or internally or whatever this repo represents. So that means that, from that aspect, the code you're proposing is as much as your reviewers as it is yours, because ultimately this code is going to end up in your team's or your company's code into like the main branch of a repository where it will be presumably consumed. So that means that, even though you wrote the changes and you own the changes, they're not purely owned by you. They're also owned by the team and ultimately also your reviewers. And finally, as an author, it'll be your changes displayed as both a code diff and as a list of commits. A code diff being like the green and red sort of screen that I showed you earlier with the code changes, and commits are something that I'll go into right now. So commits, what are commits? Or actually before that, Does anybody have any questions about either the code review screenshots that I showed you, or what an author of a pull request is? No. Perfect. Oh, whoops, skip this line. All right, so going into commits. So if any of you have experience with Git, you might also have experience with writing commits. So it'd be like the git commit command, but taking a step back outside of just like the pure Git usage definition. So a commit can be considered a, in brackets, logical, because hopefully it is, but a logical chunk or grouping of code which is committed to a branch. So like the name suggests, so like, in plain English terms, when you commit to something, it's like you're, fully invested in, and you're, confident in something. So like committed to, exercising once a week, or committed to maintaining some sort of routine. In that sort of vein, a code commit is saying that you are writing changes and that you are committed to those changes being appropriate for whatever purpose that your PR is solving. So since they include chunks of code, some best practice for commits are that well-structured and clear commits make it much easier for reviewers to reason about and effectively review your code. An extension of that is that commit should ideally represent a logical chunk of code which serves a clear purpose, and from there, the purpose should be represented in the commit message. If you think about, code changes just in a conceptual level, they're just a written representation of, logic, essentially. And as a author of code and someone who's making changes to code, you are in effect creating changes or additions or removal of logic, which, achieves a certain purpose. And so if commits, represent a logical chunk of grouping or grouping of code, then you can imagine that also as being a logical chunk or grouping of logic. So, if you are doing A, B, C to produce D, then you would want your commits to hopefully represent the A, B, and C, just so that, it makes it clear that those are the components resulting in a D. Any questions about that before I continue? Perfect. All right, so moving on. Here is an example of some commits. This is coming from the same PR that I showed you earlier. So I did 3 commits last week. The first, ensure that all paths which can or should end a Salesforce handoff do so, and metrics are logged. Second is add metric for handoff initiation, move chat available log to make more sense. And third, add failure metric to exception handling and reconnect fallback. So hopefully at a high level, you don't have to know what a Salesforce handoff is, what a handoff chat available log, none of that really makes sense, but you can, hopefully high level see that there is like a focused purpose to these code changes, and you can sort of infer what that is from the messaging of the commit messages. Side note, something like make more sense that I wrote in the second commit, that is not typically something that I recommend, because what does it mean to make more sense? Depends, I guess eye of the beholder type of thing, who knows? But these things happen in your day-to-day work. So yeah, that's an example of some commit messages that you might see at the workplace, for good and worse, for better or for worse. All right, so some tips on how to write better commits. I have 2. So the first is to try planning your changes and coming up with a solution before writing any code. So like mentioned before, code is representation of logic. Your code changes an extension of that, or like a set of logic changes in the program that you're proposing. So in order for you to be able to logically group those changes and to group, this logic or lines of code into specific pieces of logic, it's very difficult to do so without prior planning. So, everyone's coding style is different. For me personally, I am someone who typically does just figure it out on the go, just start writing in the code base, see what happens, figure things out from there. But the side effect of that is that, sometimes your commits can be just as chaotic, or going back and forth between solutions, etc. So if possible, and especially for more junior developers who don't have what I would say might be bad habits, perhaps, in the perspective of writing clear commits. If you can write pseudocode or just take out a notebook and write down the sort of logical pieces that you think will be used to solve the problem, writing them down before, that's a very good, baseline for your commits. So if it's like, if you think about something funny like making a sandwich, what would you do? Grab some bread, whip out the mayonnaise, get the ham, assemble it. There's your sandwich, right? If it seems really obvious, but once you write it down, you can then structure your commits that way. So once you write the code to, get the bread, you can commit, got the bread, get the mayonnaise, got the mayonnaise. And it's very easy for people to follow because that's how you approach the problem in the first place. As a side benefit, if you have that documentation with you, that'll serve you really well when it comes to writing other types of technical documentation. For example, a request for comment documentation called an RFC, or some other sort of artifacts in your technical solving. Those would be a very, very helpful baseline instead of trying to circle back and remember what you were trying to think at that, time of when you were writing the changes. Second tip is if you don't get it right the first time, don't worry, you can clean things up with Git. So we talk a lot about Git in terms of like the sort of backbone system behind all of these concepts like pull requests, etc. But there are tools like Git Reset and Git Rebase, specifically interactive rebases, which allow you to essentially doctor your commits and make them look like how you want to. So I can't get into too much depth here because they can honestly take up a whole session by themselves. But just know that there are tools for you to change how you structure your commits, change the messaging of your commits, and change what files and changes are included in each commit. So if you don't commit things right the first time, or if you want to make changes, don't worry, that's all possible. It'll just take a little bit of, Git tooling knowledge in order for that to work. Perfect. So before I continue, I do see a question from Hojong in chat saying, how often should I commit? Very great question. I think that you should commit as often as there is a logical chunk in the problem you're trying to solve. So for example, like this would depend on the team as well in terms of your team culture and what you accept in terms of your best practices. But from what I've seen, too many commits sometimes gets you away from the bigger picture, and too little commits makes it too much sort of cognitive load on a person to understand those changes. So for example, in the sandwich example, if I wrote like, get the bread, get the sandwich, get the ham, get the ingredient for every single ingredient, yes, it's very clear, but it could be argued that, get ingredients, assemble ingredients, produce sandwich might be something a bit more intuitive, and maybe you don't need to know how every ingredient is fetched. On the other side, get the sandwich, take sandwich out of bag, place it on my cutting board, prepare both slices. That might be going way too far. So sorry, I can't come up with a more real world example, but it is definitely a subjective matter. And my best tip is to do what feels best for you, and then to adjust based on the feedback of your reviewers. That would be the safest and the most appropriate for your team in question, or for the audience of your pull request. So hope that answered your question. And anyone else have any questions about commits or how to write better commits?
I would say one thing, like one question that does come up quite often is that if you have like a bug within your code base and you're trying to fix the bug, some people tend to say that they've fixed the bug, and then in the commit message it just says bugged fixed. And so like, are there any tips that you have there and as to how we can go about like making those commit messages better?
100%. Yeah. So this is going to the realm of bug fixing, which is a large topic on its own. But I think, in my opinion, you can break down a bug fix, or you can consider a bug fix to be an undesired result or outcome of the current code in the product. So in order to fix a bug, there has to be changes to some logic. And that bug would have a root cause, behaviors which, identify that it is a bug. So for example, if it's like, unexpected, formatting on a web page of components, like you thought it was responsive, but things are just flying all over the place, that would be the result. But it would happen for a reason, perhaps like, you used absolute sizes and it was conflicting in certain screen sizes, or, the breakpoints in your media query were not set properly or something. Either way, because a code change is required, that means that there was a change in logic, and that is something that you can explain. So for that reason, I highly recommend, even if it's a small one or a complex one, I would recommend making sure that any changes in logic which are substantial and contribute to fixing the bug be represented in the commit, and not just consider a bug to be like a separate thing from a code change, because it's just a different flavor of code change at the end of the day. Awesome. Any other questions? Oh, perfect. All right. So that's the commits, in other words, like the code changes themselves. Now moving on to writing the actual PR. So in my experience and from talking with the team, the key to writing a useful pull request is to think of it as writing a story or an exposition. So there are two components to any PR. The first is that there is a problem that the team is trying to solve. Like mentioned, it could be a bug that needs fixing, or a new feature that needs to be developed, or some housekeeping work, some sort of task. Regardless, there's a problem that has to be solved. And your PR is introduced due to you wanting to propose code changes, which are the solution to that problem, or are a proposed solution to that problem. So as someone who writes a PR, your goal is to identify what problem is being looking to be solved, and B, how does your PR solve that problem via your code changes? So some tips on PR storytelling. There are a few. The first would be to briefly explain what the problem is. So it could be a description like, we discovered a bug that causes feature X to fail under specific conditions, or, clients are complaining that, this aspect of the app is not up to standard. Either way, you want to make that very clear on what those, what is it that the problem is, in words that anybody can understand. And if possible, you would want to link something like a Jira ticket or a GitHub issue, or something where it does have like the initial reporting or some other context on the issue for folks to look and read, take a look and read if additional context are needed, or just for the information. The second would be to walk through what the changes are. So now that the reader knows what the problem is, you want to say in, again, simpler terms, what the changes that you propose are from a functional perspective. So for example, you can say that, to mitigate a bug, a check was actually added before, function Z, or a call of something, which disallows it from being called when conditions A and B are not met. Or if you have like a form which doesn't have enough description, for example, you can say that the tooltips for the form have been updated to be more specific, and links to supporting documentation have been added to those tooltips. Something in plain English which describes what your code changes represent in a plain English way where people can follow. And third, you want to point to where the changes are. So this would be specifically at the code level. So if you said that the tooltips have changed for a form, for example, you can point at, like, say, in source/components/ I don't know, request form, this line, the tooltip info was changed. Or if it was a bug, in this particular file on this line, this gate was added. Something to just add a little bit of context on where those changes exist in the code. This is a little bit less important if you have very good commit messages, because your commit messages will probably, relay the same information, but you can consider it like a type of, redundancy to also, express that in another area. Or if you could, cover any gaps which you might have missed in your commit messages. And lastly, you need to tell your reviewers how to test and validate your changes. So if you consider that, these changes are owned by the team at large and all of your reviewers as well as yourself, you need to be able to prove to them that your changes work. And the best way to do that is to let them know how to test your changes. So, if instead of, writing something vague like, oh, test the feature, make sure it works, you might want to be a little bit more specific. So a better example might be, enter an API key in the config, test action Z, confirm that it works. And if you want to take it an even step further and really handhold the reviewer, it could be something like, in the app dashboard, go to settings, integrations, and enter an API key in the config modal, and then perform action Z and confirm that behavior expected where A, B, and C occurred. So you're presenting and also like a success criteria for your change. So in other words, like, just like there's automated testing for, like unit tests to assert that, the code you're writing works, you also need to treat your, reviewers as essentially human test runners. So they're like, human machines who are going out there and testing your code for you to make sure that it works. In many ways, and in many ways, in using methods that machines can't today. So hopefully that makes sense. I see a question in chat from Jenna asking if I'll be making my slides available, and definitely I can make those available after the call in the Study Tank channel. But any other questions before I continue?
Quick question.
Hmm?
So for like when you walk through like that point about like walking through what the changes are and like pointing to where the changes are, what like really differentiates like those two things? Like if I tell you what the changes are, do I really need to explain where it is, or is that kind of a if I do the first thing really well, I don't really need to do the other thing?
Great question. I think it depends on the complexity of the changes and how many files it touches. So for example, if it's just like, I fixed the padding of a header and then you point to the header component, it could be arguably of limited use. But if you are especially in a bug fixing scenario, or if you're developing a complex feature, like, just using an example from work, when a chatter talks to an agent in a live chat, their messages are now displayed in this particular format, right? That change could represent or be represented in many different files, different pieces of it existing in different files, serving different purposes. And if you just look at the code diff and see like 6 files changed, it's pretty difficult to know where to start with all that, which ones are for what change, etc. So yeah, I'd say it's important to keep them separated, although the importance does depend, I would say, on the complexity and the number of files changed.
It's kind of like the reach, I guess, right? Like, is it really affecting a lot of files or something?
Exactly. Yeah. The reach of the changes, the another fancy term with the blast radius. So if things do fail, where would those failure points be is another way to think of it. Yeah, there's a lot of
Would that be like a separate kind of thing in itself? Like, we'd also mention alongside to where and what the changes are, like what this affects. That would be a good thing to add as well, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I would probably include that in the what the changes are section, so what's being affected and why. Or arguably in the point to where section is, it's very just like an implementation detail of a file you're changing or a function you're changing. But yeah, like making specific notes of, potential like failure cases, what can boom, go boom if things go wrong, or,
Right.
what to be concerned about. That is, a good thing to add there as well. So great point.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. I'm definitely gonna do that next time.
Yeah, sounds good. Great question, Sam. Any other questions on the topic?
An interesting question that I had was like with the advent of things like automated testing, um, and if we're doing things like end-to-end testing, like
Mhm.
is reviewers reviewers doing testing,
Mhm.
um, can you say that it becomes redundant for the reviewers themselves to do testing if the system itself has already integrated these automated test frameworks?
Fantastic question. It depends. So I would say there are a few vectors that I would consider in terms of being able to completely replace a human tester with automated testing. The first is the complexity of the changes. So for example, if it touches many systems and requires a more like, you consider like an E2E or an integration type test, a CDC type or contract-driven, consumer-driven contract type test where, you're testing behavior for full flow. A lot of times, it's either difficult or difficult to implement those kind of testing for many companies, or those tests just don't exist. And getting up those tests up and running is difficult in itself. So human testing could be considered a replacement for that. And in other times, there's some behavior which might require a lot of like finicky, manual labor, like, messing around with the network state, like turning off your internet connection, turning it back on, or like doing some human intervention somewhere, or working with like integrations with third-party systems where it might not be feasible today to get those automated. So in those cases, I would say that it's not, completely replaceable yet, but also in those cases with the right tooling and the right setup, you can automate those. And I think it's the goal for a lot of companies to be able to automate everything possible. The goal being 100%. So you are correct. Automation where possible is preferred, I would say.
Awesome. Thanks.
No worries. Any other questions on the topic before I continue? Perfect. All right. So two final things about reviewers. So once you have about writing a pull request. So once you have a pull request ready, you need to ask for reviews. So three important guidelines here are: the first is that make sure that your PR description is 100% complete and that your changes are finalized. Because as soon as you tag someone for a review, you can expect that they will look at those changes and treat them like they're final. So you don't want to be going around and making changes, because not only is it frankly wasting people's time, but it is also causing a lot of additional cognitive load on these individuals where they have to backtrack on changes they've already reviewed and then replace it with knowledge from new changes, or in the PR description, similar pattern. It is, a lot of times harmful to them as well. Second is to be mindful of who you tag for reviews. Sometimes, you don't want to tag the same people every time, or, there's a strategy to who you tag. A common one is in a team, you might want to tag someone who is a subject matter expert or is very well aware of the code domain, so they can get an expert's eyes onto your code and give that perspective. And also someone who maybe is less experienced with that part of the code to give you a fresh pair of eyes, and also to facilitate knowledge sharing so that they become more aware of that part of the code. So, there's no rule for this. A lot of teams have their own guidelines on this, but who you tag is, will affect the types of reviews that you receive and the quality as well. And third is, if possible, pairing is great. I mean, pairing on a PR review, with the reviewers will allow you to answer questions, ad hoc as they come up, to identify gaps on where your explanation might have maybe fallen short for certain people, and to, bridge those gaps to make them understand the changes better. It just provides a really great session for you to get more higher quality and more in-depth reviews, and to speed up the process. Keep in mind that, some teams do push towards a more async form of work, at which point, it becomes more important for your PR description and commits to be a bit more cleaner. But regardless, if possible, pairing is a very strong tool to use. And lastly, what to expect from your reviewers. So number one, assume your code reviewer knows nothing about the changes you're making. This is not always the case, especially if you're working in a team, but it's generally a good rule of thumb to do this, so you ensure that your change descriptions or your PR descriptions and your commit messages are as clear as possible, and your testing steps are also as clear as possible, so you don't, leave any gaps. Second, the reviewers have a limited time to review your code, so you want to be as explicit and clear as possible. Wasting time on the team, especially for, lots of engineers, company pays them a wage. That wage is probably expensive. If you waste an hour of their time going back and forth, with an unfinished PR, etc., that is actually very costly for the company. So keeping that in mind, it is important for you to respect that. And third is, your reviewers will likely disagree with you, and sometimes words will be strong, but in a healthy team, those strong words will be for the purpose of ensuring that the best possible code goes out to solve an issue. And I recommend being able to, expect that and to embrace it as constructive criticism, and a forum or an opportunity for you to either, strengthen your own beliefs on a topic or to learn new things about a topic and accept others' opinions and thoughts. So that's about it from the author's perspective. Any questions on your role as an author before we continue to your role as a reviewer? Perfect. All right, so moving on towards our role as a reviewer. So I'm going to move through some of these slides a little bit quick, just keeping conscious of time, but hopefully I don't move quickly on slides which are most important. If you do feel like I'm going too fast, please let me know and I can take a pause. So a reviewer of a PR. So we've talked about it, or a reviewer in a code review. So we've talked a little bit about it in the author's perspective, but as a reviewer, you can consider yourself as a person whose sole job is to prove that a problem is solved by the proposed changes. So you're on the other side of the coin. So you need to work together with the author, because your author is the one who wrote those changes, and you need to ensure that the problem is solved up to your team standards and meets performance criteria. So note there is that just because it works doesn't mean it's right or solved, especially in teams where, performance is a high concern. If it takes too many cycles, or if you're using like an inefficient algorithm, that can have catastrophic effects on the product. So working and completed up to your team standards, two different things. And the third is, as a reviewer, in order for you to assess that a problem is solved, you need to know the whys, whats, and how of the changes. So this is, why is a change even being proposed? What does a change represent? And how does a change solve the problem? So before I go into guidelines, actually, any questions on what a reviewer is and what your role and goals are as a reviewer? Perfect. Awesome. So some general guidelines on being a reviewer. So some of these are pretty obvious, but also very important. The first, don't be a jerk. So it's very easy for developers to think that there are right and wrong ways of doing something, and that could represent itself in comments which effectively amount to, hey, you're doing this wrong, do it like this. Or, why does your code suck? It's something that I've heard actually a few times in my career as well, without any constructive feedback or whatever. So you need to make sure that the feedback that you do give, or the comments you do make, are actually constructive. I'm not saying that you cannot criticize. That's far from the point. Criticism is definitely valid as long as they're constructive. So if they are using the wrong algorithm, maybe point them to the right one. Or if they are, writing things that are just completely wrong, maybe explain why that's the case. Number one, that'll make things more productive for everybody. And number two, you as a reviewer can learn how to communicate about these things more effectively as well. Second is to remember that you are a blocker. When someone tags you for a code review, they need your approval to get that code into production, which means that you need to be timely in your code reviews. You need to give it your best and be comprehensive about it, because you are what's blocking that from going to production, and also its successful release in production. If you leave any gaps, if you approve a defect in the code, that's as much on you as it is the author of the pull request. Third, I mentioned this a few times, work with the author. It's not you, reviewers, versus the author. It's not some like fight that you're doing between the two of you to try to see who's better, who's right and wrong. It's all of your code at the end of the day, and you have to own it as well. Fourth, ask lots of questions. Don't assume anything, because those assumptions could lead to some critical failures if those weren't shared with the author of the PR. So make sure that you have a clear understanding of everything. Finally, avoid bike shedding. So it's a piece of jargon, which essentially means avoid talking about things which don't really matter at the end of the day. So there are things which are material concerns, right? So this would be like performance of the code, whether it actually solves a problem or not. Something around bike shedding could be, and this is, arguable, style of the code. Oh, I don't like the way you named this variable, not in a way that makes a material difference, but I just like moving these words around. Or like, oh, we should use, this syntax versus another, like avoid the if else, use a ternary, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. And if that's the focus of your review for the majority, it's not an effective use of time or resources. Yeah, so those are the guidelines that I recommend. Any questions on those? Perfect. All right, so moving on, comments. So comments are quite an interesting topic. So with comments, these are essentially, as a reviewer, your way of communicating with the author of the PR on your thoughts about a change or any other pertinent discussions you want to have. So the important thing about comments is learning how to communicate about code and technical problems is actually most of your job. So especially as you move into more senior roles, you're going to most likely spend less time coding and more time talking about code and solving problems. You're not really the person expected to get a solution to work. You're the person trying to find problems to then find solutions for. And in order to do that effectively, it involves communicating with non-technical stakeholders, with other technical stakeholders, maybe cross-functionally in other teams or within your own team. But regardless, communication is the center of all of that. So the earlier you can learn, how to effectively communicate about code and technical problems is, you'll be that much faster moving forward in your career, essentially, and being an effective team member. That's my dog. So there are three guidelines that I would recommend for comments. First, there's no right or wrong way. You can write PR comments essentially however you like, or however you think is most effective. However, that being said, there are some guidelines and ways in which you can be more effective than otherwise. But in general, your comment should be as concise, clear, and if necessary, actionable as possible. So moving forward, there's something called conventional comments. So I'm not sure if folks have heard of this. I've heard it for the first time in my current organization, but you can visit the website conventionalcomments.com, but it's essentially a standard of formatting comments with the goal of improving readers' expectations and machine readability. So here we have two, the Alice in Wonderland themed comments. So we can have one from the Cheshire Cat. Suggestion, security. I'm a bit concerned that we're implementing our own DOM purifying function here. Could we consider using the framework instead? Or from a mouse. Question, non-blocking. At this point, does it matter which thread has won? Maybe to prevent a race condition, we should keep looping until they've all won. Very technical discussions, but at a glance, you can see that there are some interesting parts to these comments that you wouldn't see in just a plain text comment. So breaking it down a little bit. So in conventional comments, there are some components. The first is the label, second, the decorations, and then the subject. Those are the two required components here are the label and subject. The label is what kind of comment is being left, and the subject is sort of the main message of the comment. And the decorations are sort of an optional set of additional tags to categorize the comment. And the discussion is any supporting statements, context, or reasoning. So going back to this example from a mouse, if we dissect this, we can see that the label would be question, the subject would be, at this point, doesn't matter which thread has won. A decoration would be non-blocking, and the discussion would be to, maybe to prevent a race condition, etc. So in this breaking down, you can see that, the label or the main purpose of the comment is to ask a question. The decorator non-blocking denotes that it's a non-blocking question, meaning that even if this question is not answered, it will not block the merging of this pull request. The subject, is the subject of the question, in this case, the question itself. And the discussion is any additional context, maybe fueling what, drove you to ask this question in the first place, etc. So I'm not going to go too deep into the different labels, decorations, etc. that exist with conventional comments. You can, I highly encourage you to check the website, conventionalcomments.com, to take a look at those. But it is quite a powerful tool in sort of setting a baseline of, what kinds of questions you can ask and what purpose they serve, how important they are to the discussion, etc. So just to summarize, conventional comments, definitely far from the be-all end-all of code review comments. They're an excellent starting point and baseline for your own comments and to apply to your discussions. However, these standards, they help answer the how in writing the PR comments, so with what format, with what components, but they only really provide a direction on what. So, it can direct you towards writing blocking versus non-blocking comments, but what those actual comments are and the subject matter, of course, depends on, yourself, the code changes, the team, the problem, etc. So yeah, that is conventional comments. It's a pretty powerful tool in my opinion. Any questions on conventional comments in general? I know it was quite brief, but hopefully you got the idea.
So are these comments only from like the reviewer's perspective? So like it's not the way you would communicate, like let's say if you're responding to a comment.
So this, you can use it for any perspective. So whether you're the author or the reviewer. However, I most commonly see it as, the initial set of comments or in the initial set of comments that reviewers leave when reviewing a code change. And then after a conventional comment is left, that can open up a discussion, which is probably a bit more free form and not adhering to these formatting rules. But yeah, technically, definitely could be done from both parties, but most commonly, I think, from the reviewer's perspective on an actual review of the code.
Oh, okay. I was just trying to see like I do get it from the kind of viewer's perspective, but yeah, definitely I think different kind of conversations will be had when you kind of have to respond to those. And I think maybe if you want to have like obviously there's more like things I can go check out on the website as well, but I do see that there's a way to use that and meld that as well for like on the author's perspective or the responder perspective as well.
Yep, 100%. I mean, a great example is leaving like a question. If you have a question about the code you're actually changing, like different parts of the code, which maybe you didn't change but are related, or if you had a thought or a suggestion, those I've definitely seen those being used by the author as well, to leave comments in the code base. So yeah, great
Yeah,
point.
I've seen like a few of my teammates do that as well, but I never thought it like as like an I've only seen kind of like outside or I only thought this is for like outside reviewer kind of thing, but like yes, definitely I think that it's definitely useful for people talking about their own code.
Yep, 100%, 100%. Yeah, great question. Sorry, for the sake of time, we have 2 minutes left, and I do have a hard stop at the hour mark, so I am going to quickly breeze by these slides. Apologies. If you have any questions about these slides, please reach out to me in Slack. Happy to go into it more with you. So, there's a lot you can do now. So, big question I hear from juniors is, how can I review if I'm a junior? I don't really know much. I'm not confident. I don't want to be, scrutinized or judged by the quality of my comments. What can I do? So my tips are first, reviewing the code isn't about just approving and getting something shipped. It's a tool for learning, knowledge sharing, and quality improvement. Now, what that means is, as a junior, not knowing something or lacking confidence doesn't make you a burden, but by starting a discussion, you provide value by learning. Because, as an engineer, you're pretty much a cog in a machine. And, the higher performance you are, the better the machine will perform. So, anytime you don't know something, that's an opportunity for you to learn and become stronger. Second, pairing, huge benefit. Pairing with someone more senior can help you guide those discussions and how to do reviews. Tied to that, senior developers should love teaching and mentoring others because that's literally part of their job description. Finally, there is no such thing as a dumb question, and I really want to stress this in like a lot. Technically my title as a senior doesn't really mean that much because I make the stupidest mistakes, ask the stupidest questions all the time. And a lot of times some junior folks, give me the answer, and titles don't matter. It's just a question you had, it's being answered. No question is stupid. If anyone thinks otherwise, I wouldn't hang out with those kind of people. They're pretty pretty unkind. So specifically for more junior folks, how can you improve? So biggest tip, review by doing. Find opportunities to do code reviews and to have your own code reviewed. So reviewed others' code from open source projects with each other's, etc. Mentorship is invaluable for this regard. Get comfortable with getting your code out there, and maybe take part in activities like mob review sessions, which I will talk about right now. Quick segue into a new program that we're doing at Tech Tank. It's a bi-weekly interchanging session with study tank sessions in the same time slot. It'll be an opportunity for folks to both review code and have your code reviewed. Side note, if you have code that you want to have reviewed, please submit them to have them showcased in these sessions. And we're going to have stuff like breakout rooms and opportunities for real and focused feedback. I'll be personally leading those and running them. So hopefully if you have questions or any content here about this presentation, I can help apply them in those sessions as well. So skipping question time because unfortunately I do have another meeting to run to. But I honestly want to thank you all for taking the time to listen. Hope you got some value out of this presentation. And if you have any questions about the subject material, please feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to explain more in depth. And also, like Jenna mentioned, I will be posting these slides publicly within the Study Tank channel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Davidson. This was like really informative and I look forward to the mob review sessions.
Totally. No worries. Gonna hop off now. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Have a nice night. Bye.
Bye-bye.